Hello, and welcome to today's lecture on the founding of Rome. I'm your professor, Dr. Rob Steffen, and today we are going to see the origins of one of the greatest empires the world has ever seen, and that of course is Rome, and we'll see at kind of what happens to get the whole thing started. So we're going to start by kind of setting the scene, see how we got there. There we're going to situate Rome kind of geographically within its context in Italy. From there we'll look at the kind of mythical foundations of the city itself, and then take a look at Romulus, its first king. So let's see how we got here. So way back in the Hellenistic world, 400, 500 years before Rome is ever a thing, we get the successors of Alexander the Great doing battle to try to claim dominion over his empire. And yet they're never able to really put it back together. So the Ptolemies in Egypt and the Seleucids over in the Near East, they do battle, but they're never able to kind of conquer one another. And then all of a sudden, they're gone. What happens? Well, Rome happens. So Rome swoops in from the west, destroying all comers, right? Destroying all Hellenistic kingdoms. And the question is like, where did Rome come from, right? Like Rome hadn't even entered the story yet, and then over the course of 100 years, all of a sudden it takes out all the Hellenistic kingdoms, which were really quite powerful. So how do we get there? Well, we begin in the early Iron Age, right? From around 950 to around 753 BC, and we can see what's going on there. We have all these different tribes throughout Italy, and it's the Etruscans that are the strongest of those tribes. And we see that the Etruscans are much stronger than Rome in the early days, and in large part because they have a lot of contact with Greek and Phoenician culture. And we can see that in their pottery styles. Etruscan pottery very much mimics that of kind of Athenian black figure and red figure pottery. We can see that in their temples, which have similar kind of rectilinear colonnaded temples. And we can see that in their sculpture, where the archaic sculpture of the Etruscans and Greeks are very, very similar. Although the Etruscans make it out of terracotta, the Greeks make it frequently out of stone. So let's go ahead and see what happens when we move from this kind of early Iron Age to the monarchy in Rome. So Rome itself is situated within the Italian Peninsula. And we can think about kind of what that means in terms of its benefits and drawbacks. Again, the Italian Peninsula is very heavily guarded in the north by the Alps. There are no strong kind of internal barriers to cohesion. You get the Apennines running north-south, that's another mountain range, but they're kind of short enough, they're low enough that it's not a big deal. A lot of rivers connect things throughout the peninsula, and most things are near the coast because it's a long, skinny peninsula. It makes everything very easily reachable by boat. And in the days prior to Rome, we get a lot of different kind of cultural groups, tribes throughout the Italian peninsula. And they're all known for something, right? The Ligurians always end up getting beaten up by Rome. The Veneti are great metal workers. The Celts are raiding the Romans from time to time. And the Etruscans, kind of in between Rome and kind of the Alps, end up being the strongest of these early Italian tribes. Now, when we think of ancient Rome, right, if you build a kind of image of the city in your mind, it very frequently looks something like this. Like a crazy, busy, dense urban area. And that makes sense. At the peak of its power, Rome had like 1 million people, the largest population in the world for over 1,500 years, okay? So it very much, this is a recreation, a model recreation of the city. That's kind of what we think about. But when we think about the founding of Rome, we've got to have a very different picture in our mind. So instead of everything that densely populated, what we want to think about is a series of kind of steep hills arising out of the landscape and the settlements kind of occurring on top of each of these hills. Now, this is actually a little bit after the very, very origins. At the very beginning, nothing would have been in between the hills. It only would have been hilltop settlements. And when we look at this kind of in plain view, we can see the name of the hills, right? We call Rome the city of 7 hills, and you can see the Capitoline and the Palatine, the Avetine, the Caelian, the Esquiline, the Viminal, the Quirinal. You don't need to know all the names, but realize that in the earliest days, it's a series of steep hills arising out of the landscape, and that offers protection for the people living on them. I kind of like this map here. It's a, I don't know, cheesy little map, but it does a good job of kind of highlighting where the hills would be and how you get these kind of weird little marshy areas in between them. And then over here to the west, in the bend of the Tiber River, we get what's known as the Campus Martius, right? Or the Campus Martius, the field of Mars. And that's where early Roman troops would do their military training. So let's take a run through the mythical origins of the city of Rome. It all begins with our hero Aeneas fleeing the burning remains of Troy. So he's always depicted with his father Anchises on his back and his son Ascanius by his side, holding the sword of Troy and escaping as Troy burns. And Troy's burning, of course, as a result of the Trojan War. So the foundation of Rome picks up right at the end of the Trojan War, right? Kind of right at the end of the epic cycle of the Iliad and the Odyssey that they were a part of. Now, after Aeneas kind of flees the city, he gets on a boat, he gets a few men, and he starts sailing all around the Mediterranean. So he goes down to Crete, he goes up to Buthrotum, down to Sicily, over to Carthage, back to Mount Eryx, to Cumae, and eventually settles on the shores of Italy. Now, this story is told in the Aeneid, and then once he arrives, he has these kind of conflicts with the local Italian tribes where he lands, and those are the Latins. Now, how do we know this, right? How do we know anything about the founding of Rome? I wanted to kind of bring this up because we were just talking about Aeneas. And in your head, you might be like, well, all right, so end of the Trojan War, if that actually happened, it's around 1200 BC. How does anybody in the Roman Empire know what was going on back then? Well, we have a couple different people writing. One of the guys is Virgil. He's the author of the Aeneid. But Virgil's writing at the time of Augustus, the first emperor. So this is, Augustus takes over he's kind of proclaimed emperor in 27 BC. So this is over 700 years after the founding of Rome, over 1,000 years before Aeneas would have left the walls of Troy. And what ends up happening is it's actually Augustus the emperor commissioning Virgil to write this kind of epic story about the Roman people so that they have this tale that's kind of equivalent to the Iliad and the Odyssey in the Greek world. So we get the founding of Rome in 753. We get Virgil writing over 700 years later. And so when we're looking back at these stories, it's important to keep in mind that A, they're quite a bit they're written quite a bit later. B, they're fairly mythological as opposed to historical. And C, they're telling a highly politicized tale, right? There's a political purpose to this, and that's to justify the rule of Augustus and the emperors in Rome, and justify the power of the Roman people. So how do we get from Aeneas to Romulus, right? You might be thinking, okay, well, Rome is founded in 753, but Aeneas was end of the Bronze Age, which we know is like 1200, 1150. So somehow we have to cover about 400 years between Aeneas and Romulus. And so what do? Well, we do a whole biblical thing, right? So we got Aeneas, and then he begets somebody, and 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 he begets somebody. And eventually, after a bunch of generations, we finally get Numitor and Amulius. And you've probably never heard of Numitor and Amulius, but that's where our story of Romulus and Remus actually starts. So Numitor over here and Amulius right here, they are brothers. And Numitor is the king of Alba Longa. And in the early days of Rome, we can see Rome right here, and it's surrounded by a bunch of little settlements, and one of the closest is Alba Longa. Now, Amulius, as the younger brother, is always jealous of his older brother and his older brother's kind of right to rule. And so one day, he basically overthrows his older brother, imprisons him, and takes the throne of Alba Longa. Now, once he takes the throne, he's got to ensure that basically nobody's going to come after him. So he imprisons his brother Numitor, and he takes Numitor's daughter, a woman by the name of Rhea Silvia, and he makes her a Vestal Virgin. Now his goal here, essentially, is to A, not kill her. You can't kill her because that would incur the wrath of the gods. But B, make sure that she can't have any kids. And that's important because, Amulius does not want Rhea Silvia's kids basically coming back for revenge. Now, the Vestal Virgin's great for this because she can't, make out with anybody, can't have any kids, but somehow she gets pregnant, right? So imagine that, a Vestal Virgin, she gets pregnant. The penalty if a Vestal Virgin has sex with anybody is they're buried alive, which is pretty bad. So she's got to come up with some kind of story here, and she's like, Mars, the god Mars impregnated me when I was sleeping. And so she says it's the god Mars, and 9 months later, she has 2 twin baby boys, Romulus and Remus. Now, when Romulus and Remus are born, there are a couple different ways the story works here, but basically Amulius hears word of it, and Rhea Silvia's got to get rid of them. So Amulius sends somebody down to basically kill the babies. They put them in the Tiber River here, the river that runs near the city of Rome, which hasn't been founded yet. And in that river, the river god saves them. So it's kind of like a Moses in the basket sort of scenario. The babies float down the river, and eventually they come safely to rest along the shores. And along those shores, they're picked up by a she-wolf. In Latin, we call it a lupa. And the she-wolf suckles the child and raises them in their early days until they're later found by a farmer, a guy by the name of Faustulus, who ends up raising them up into their teenage years. Now, one of the interesting things here is that the word lupa is also the Latin word for prostitute. A she-wolf is also known as a prostitute. And so one of the things that we think might be going on here is that it's essentially the farmer's wife might have been a prostitute, right? That's how she made her living. And so she's the one actually bringing them back to the farmer. So they're raised by the farmer Faustulus, and Romulus and Remus kind of grow up, again, maybe taken in by this lupa, maybe perhaps she was a prostitute. And eventually, when they're of age, they start to make their way back to Alba Longa to overthrow Amulius and reinstate their grandfather. And so when they make that charge, they're able to overtake Amulius, get him out of the picture, and their grandfather, Numitor, once again, is the rightful king of Alba Longa. So they've done their duty, and after they reinstate their grandfather, they end up going back to that place along the Tiber River where they eventually came to rest. And that place was somewhere right around here, right around the bend of the Tiber River. And that's where they decide to found a city that will eventually become Rome. Now this is where this kind of story, where Romulus and Remus had always been good buddies, good brothers, this is where it starts to get a little weird. So they start to argue here about where exactly the city should be founded. So Romulus says it should be founded on the Palatine, the hill right here. Remus, however, says it should be founded on the Aventine. And then things start basically using kind of Etruscan divination techniques to make claims about where the city should be founded. So Remus says, hey, I saw 6 doves fly out, right? And right kind of over the Aventine, and that says that's where the city should be. And then, of course, Romulus is like, well yeah, but I saw 12 doves. And then Remus is like, but I saw them first. And they argue about these birds and where they're flying and how many there are. And they basically can't agree on where to build the city. So Romulus starts building his city on the Palatine. Remus starts building his city on the Aventine. And this is where the story gets even weirder, right? These brothers that had once gotten along so well, eventually Remus comes over the walls of Romulus's city on the Palatine. And we don't know exactly why he was doing this, but he kind of, for whatever reason, comes over the wall, and Romulus straight up kills him. So Romulus has killed his brother, and afterwards he says, this is going to happen to anybody who comes over the walls of Rome. As kind of a statement that for years and decades and centuries to come, anybody who invades Rome will die. And so Remus is out of the picture, right? We have Rome today. We don't have Rheims. And on April 21st of 753 BC, the city of Rome is founded by Romulus on the Palatine Hill. Now, if you remember one of the dates for this course, right, there aren't that many exact dates you got to remember. Remember, 753 BC, the kind of mythical founding of the city of Rome. Now, one of the really cool things is that when we look at ancient Rome archaeologically, right, what we looked at previously there in that story was kind of the mythical story of the foundation. But when we look at this archaeologically and try to find out when Rome was actually settled, we've got burials and stuff that go back a little bit earlier. But when we look at the earliest settlements, they actually are on the Palatine Hill, which is kind of cool. And B, they actually date to sometime in the 8th century BC, right? The 700s BC. So we don't know whether these huts, we can see these huts where the wall would have gone in these kind of grooves, and then the roof would have been held up on posts that go into these kind of holes, and they're cut into stone. That's why we still have them today. And what's cool is that they match up with these kind of Etruscan-style houses. This is a funerary urn, but it's kind of modeled on what a house would look like. If you kind of go ahead and make that structure, it looks like that. And this sort of thing fits very nicely into the archaeological remains that we have. And it dates again to around 753. Do we know the exact date? Absolutely not. But it's in that kind of range. All right, so let's look at our first king of Rome, a guy by the name of Romulus. So one of the problems that Romulus has got is he's got to populate a city, right? And so he starts getting outcasts from other cities, right? People who had been accused of crimes, social outcasts, that kind of thing. And they're all dudes. So Rome in the early days is a huge city of dudes, not particularly socially attractive dudes. And they've got to have women if they want this place to last more than a single generation. And so they send out, right? They send out emails and they ask all their neighbors, hey, can we have some of your women? And you can imagine what the response is. No, absolutely not. You cannot have our women. And so Romulus has got to get a little bit tricky. And what he does is he writes over to a neighboring group known as the Sabines. And he says, you know what? Why don't you guys come over for a party? All right? Bring your men, bring your women. We'll provide the wine. And we just want to show you how cool our new city is. And so the Sabines show up for this party. And they're eating and they're drinking. And sometime in the middle of the party, the signal's given. And the Romans kind of burst forth with their weapons. They kick out all the Sabine men. And they seize the Sabine women. And this is an episode that we call the rape of the Sabines. They're not raping them in kind of the modern sense of the word right now. It comes from the Latin rapio, which means to seize. So they're seizing the Sabine women and taking them for themselves. And that's what they'll kind of use eventually to populate the city of Rome. Now, the Sabines, as you might imagine, are not particularly happy about this. And so they kind of go home and they start plotting about how they can get revenge on the Romans. And luckily enough, they have this woman Tarpeia, a Roman woman who's ready to betray the city. And she's kind of portrayed as a greedy woman here. And what she does is she asks for what's on the Sabines' arms. And the Sabines are known for wearing really kind of elaborate gold jewelry along their arms. And so she tells them the secret way into the city. And when they finally kind of get in there and she asks for what's on their arms, they give her not their gold jewelry, but their massive shields that also kind of rest upon their arms. And they beat her to death with their shields. So this is known as the treason of Tarpeia. It allows the Sabines back into the city of Rome. And eventually the Sabines are actually able to take over the Capitoline Hill. Now this sets off a huge battle between the Romans and the Sabines, and they're fighting, the Romans on one side, the Sabine men on the other side, and eventually in the middle of this battle, right, bloodshed everywhere, the Sabine women, right, that had been living with the Roman men, bust into the middle of the battle. And they say, guys, cut it out, right? You guys on this side, you're our new husbands, we're staying with you. You guys on this side, you're our brothers and you're our fathers, all right? So if you want to kill anybody, if you want to keep fighting, kill us. And that'll put at least an end of the struggle between you guys. But quit fighting with each other. And this shows this kind of really paradoxical position of women within the mythological history of ancient Rome. On the one hand, right, they're being taken as possessions by the Romans. And yet, on the other hand, they have this kind of incredible power, right? They're portrayed as these kind of heroes that are able to put an end to the conflict between the Romans and the Sabines. Now, Romulus continues his rule, essentially fighting with a bunch of the other groups right around the city of Rome, trying to expand Roman territory. And at the end of his life, everybody's out making sacrifices to the gods, and a storm washes in, right? Storm clouds wash in. And everybody else takes cover. And after the storm comes down, everybody else goes back out. And Romulus, who had been at the altar, is no longer there. And the story was that he was taken up into the heavens to kind of rule with Jupiter and those kind of in the pantheon of the gods. So, a couple concluding thoughts. In the beginning, Rome is very, very small, right? It's set on these kind of series of steep hills within the city. And that's just one of many different kind of groups that's going on within the broader range of Italy. So in the beginning, Greece expands very, very quickly. Rome expands very, very slowly. And our history deals in large part with these kind of mythical origins. So the story we have of the early days of Rome is very much kind of like a mytho-history, right? Maybe some elements are true, but in large part what we're looking at is a mythology. But what's kind of cool here is that when we look at things archaeologically, right, and try to reconstruct what actually happened, the founding of Rome does seem to match up, at least temporally and geographically, with what we get in those myths. And so that just kind of is the mythical story, along with a little bit of the archaeological evidence for what we get with the founding of Rome.